It's my great pleasure to convene the first of 5 meetings we're having this semester of the Lyceum Student Speaker Series. The LSSS was established by Dr. Hoffpower and by my predecessor, Dr. Jeffrey, to provide a forum in which Lyceum scholars could present their work to their peers, faculty, family, and friends. Our second meeting of the series will take place precisely 2 weeks from right now, on March 31st, where Mr. Galloway will be speaking about Plato's Meno. Today, of course, we have Brother Harmon going to speak to us about John Calvin. He's going to speak based on his directed study that he did last spring with me on Calvin and on the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The plan is very simple. After an introduction, Mason will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. Students will get first priority in the Q&A, so load the questions up, ready to fire. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Miss Abby Reddy, another junior Lyceum scholar, to give the proper introduction for our speakers.
Hello. So our speaker today is someone who is not only a longtime classmate, but also someone I consider a dear friend. His commitment to faith is admirable and is only rivaled by his commitment to excellence in and out of the classroom. When you think of a 5-year plan, you might think of Mao, but I think of Mason. He's the most determined and organized person that I know. He always has a long-term plan, and in the short term, he's on top of his work. Right now, he plans to graduate in May with a degree in political science, get married in August, move to Portland with his fiancée, Sophie, eventually come back to teach at his old high school in Northeast Columbia, and then go to seminary. Yet for all his focus, Mason is a man of many colors. Before having class with him, I never thought it possible for someone to so seamlessly navigate a conversation from 80s new wave music to Reformed theology. He's the farthest thing from a stick in the mud, and he'll be the first to make a joke in class, often of the pun variety. Taking a page from his book, or should I say thesis, I feel confident that he was predestined to be here right now. I can think of no one better to speak on John Calvin's Doctrine of Civil Government, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Mr. Mason Harmon.
Thank you, Abby. That's probably way more generous than is actually the truth. And to my classmates, I apologize. You're going to have to hear me talk way more than I normally do in class. I already talk a lot, so get ready. But seriously, it's really a huge honor to be here today. I really do appreciate the Lyceum program, the Clemson Institute, for allowing me to be here. It really is a great honor. I'm really excited about it. John Calvin was born in 1509 in Noyon, France, and died in 1564 in Geneva, Switzerland. He was the son of a boatman, but due to his father's influence in the church, was able to receive a theological education in Paris. After his time there, he decided to take up a profession in law, moving to Orleans to pursue a doctorate and study Greek. He published his first work, a commentary on Seneca's On Clemency, at age 23. Around this time, Calvin was struck by a new conviction in the authority of Scripture, which he later referred to as his conversion. His subsequent questioning of the Roman Church meant that staying in France was no longer an option. The king, Francis I, had begun to jail and execute those who espoused the teachings of the Reformation. Calvin eventually found asylum in Basel, Switzerland, where he first wrote his initial outline of his seminal work, Institutes of the Christian Religion. After relocating to Geneva a few years later, Calvin quickly rose to positions of authority within the city. However, the city soon turned on him and his ideas regarding church and government and exiled him around 1538. Happily, a shift in political climate quickly followed, and the city begged Calvin to return. He would spend the rest of his life in Geneva, making it one of the great centers of the Reformation. Many biographers paint Calvin as a harsh and unyielding man. This is, however, far from the truth. For example, Calvin repeatedly petitioned to let women out of abusive marriages and affirmed that one could only know of one's own salvation, not anybody else's, despite what you may have heard. The harshest penalty he invoked as the leader of the Genevan church was excommunication, a last resort that he seldom used. His theology was much denser than the generic 5 points of Calvinism, to which it is so often reduced, instead revolving mainly around the Christian life. I encourage you all to read his letter to Francis I to observe firsthand the Calvin that most historians fail to describe. The earnest, pleading man who simply wanted others to know God. His dissertation on politics, then, is to be understood in this context. It comes in the last page of a roughly 1,000-page theological work and should be seen as such. Calvin's political thought can only be fully realized for what it is when one sees it as still being primarily theological. My main aim was to dissect Calvin's views on government and better understand how he views a Christian polity is to be organized. To do this, I read both the Institutes and A History of the Genevan Consistory, a council that Calvin organized in order to deal with matters of church discipline that also functioned as a kind of civil court. After preliminary discussion between the civil government and the spiritual kingdom of Christ and their distinct but complementary purposes, Calvin structures his treatise on civil government around three questions. First, what is the function of the magistrate? Second, what are the laws of a properly Christian commonwealth? And finally, third, what obedience does the people owe the magistrate? Let's begin with Calvin's statement on the purpose of civil government. Government, he says, is naturally separate from the divine kingdom of Christ. It remains related to it. It is distinct but not adverse. He says in chapter 20, the church in some measure begins the heavenly kingdom in us. Even now upon the earth and in this mortal and evanescent life commences a mortal and incorruptible blessedness. While to the civil government it is assigned, so long as we live among men, to foster and maintain the external worship of God, to defend sound doctrine and the condition of the church, to adapt our conduct to human society, to form our manners of civil justice, to conciliate us to each other, and to cherish common peace and tranquility. Government, therefore, is not a necessary evil. It is by nature divine and part of the plan of salvation that ends in heaven but begins here and now. The function of society, then, is to show one another or to be with one another in holiness and purpose, creating as much of a kingdom of God, of heaven on earth, as possible. As he says, quote, but if it is the will of God that while we aspire to true piety, we are pilgrims upon the earth, and if such pilgrimage stands in need of such aids, that is, the aids established by civil government, those who take them away from man rob him of his humanity. Calvin does not say the purposes of government are vague or subject to change either. Rather, he defines very specific actions the government is meant to perform. In addition to the statement I quoted earlier, he has the following. Its object is that no idolatry, no blasphemy against the name of God, no calumnies against his truth, nor other offenses to religion break out and be disseminated among the people, that the public quiet be not disturbed, that every man's honesty and modesty be cultivated. In short, that a public form of religion may exist among Christians and humanity among men. It seems that for Calvin, there is both an external and internal purpose of the law for society. It is meant to push everyone to have a more intimate relationship with God and to act as an example to the rest of the world for what holiness looks like. Society has a divine calling to be a certain way, and government is supposed to foster that to the best extent it can without usurping the role of the church. Government can react to external violations of the law with proportional discipline in a way that the church cannot. An interesting piece of Calvin's definition of government lies in the close relationship between the church and the state. Most in the 16th century saw the church and the state as being necessarily connected, both being involved in bettering the lives of individuals and exercising authority. However, many reformers called for a purification of the church from commingling with worldly powers. Calvin, however, seems to see this as an egregious overcorrection. Quote, as to their allegation that there ought to be such perfection in the church of God that her guidance should suffice for law, they stupidly imagine her to be such as she never can be found in the community of men. Unquote. The church is neither a replacement for the state or in its laws, nor is it meant to be part of it. They are meant to work together with the same goal of bringing the kingdom of heaven down onto earth. This relationship also seems to be beyond a mere acknowledgement or shoulder rubbing of one another. He states in paragraph 3, quote, let no one be surprised that I now attribute the task of constituting religion a right to human polity, though I seem above to place it beyond the will of man, since I no more than formally allow men at pleasure to enact laws concerning religion and the worship of God, when I approve of civil order which is directed to this end, i.e., to prevent true religion, which is contained in the law of God from being with impunity openly violated and polluted by public blasphemy. According to Calvin, government is to enforce the laws of God in a way in which the church is seemingly not allowed. Since the laws have already been ordained by God in the Scriptures, it seems to be a much more executive role rather than one of legislator. Nonetheless, Calvin gives the civil government a greater role in establishing the Christian religion than did Catholic theology, with its reliance on the Pope and bishops. The political body, then, is to work alongside the church in matters of civil discourse, enforce the law of God, and create a society that exudes the character of God through law and regulation. Indeed, this is the purpose of whole society, but is the duty of civil government to put it in action in the face of corrupt human nature. Calvin does not speak here about the institutional power of the church within society. To understand his views on this, we must look at the action of the Genevan Consistory. The purpose of the consistory was to promote discipline among the people in a grassroots way that was primarily connected with the well-being of the citizens. They would address rumors and things that had seen that were not necessarily criminal, but were clearly immoral. Calvin did not ascribe the ability to hand down any temporal penalties to the church. Rather, he kept powers of the church as being purely ecclesiastical. Jeffrey Watt says in his work on it that, quote, the consistory passed 3 types of sentences against sinners. It could admonish them, it could exclude them from the Holy Supper, and it could refer to them to the city council for criminal sentencing. Calvin understood the place of the church was not to hand out jail sentences or be the executioner. The purpose of the church was to help society just as much as the purpose of government was, but in a different manner. Even with the harshest penalty, excommunication, Calvin emphasized being gentle and refraining from using it unless absolutely necessary. The majority of the church's authority seemed to be found in social power in addition to that of the divine. While Calvin was adamant about not ostracizing members of the church for sin, the consistory still held more societal sway than the state. Spiritual discipline was a major mark of a citizen in good standing with the community. It was not enough to simply keep one's head down and follow the law. People were expected to live a holy life, and the purpose of the consistory was to foster this without undue aggression and violence. Government for Calvin is meant to contribute to holy living mainly through the effect of law, while the church was meant to rule over the causes and passions of the people. It is not the job of the church to take the execution of the law into its own hands and pass down judgment. Let's now turn to the 3 questions Calvin answers in his treatise on civil government. Beginning with the first, what is the function of the civil magistrate? Calvin says that, quote, the Lord has not only declared that he approves and is pleased with the function of magistrates, but, moreover, has strongly recommended it to us by the very honorable titles which he has conferred upon it. He goes on, wherefore no man can doubt that civil authority is, in the sight of God, not only sacred and lawful, but the most sacred, and by far the most honorable of all stations in mortal life. This extremely high view of the ruler is unsurprising after how Calvin has defined the role of government and of law. Calvin does not focus here on what happens if the magistrate does not live up to this view. That's for the 3rd section. The people's duty to the magistrates. He says simply that the holiness of the office in reflection on God's justice ought to inspire the magistrate to his duty. Quote, what zeal for integrity, prudence, meekness, continence, and innocence ought to sway those who know that they have been appointed ministers of the divine justice. How will they dare admit iniquity to their tribunal when they are told it's the throne of the living God? Moreover, quote, a much heavier curse must lie on him who deals deceitfully in a righteous calling. Calvin is much more concerned here to answer the objections dealing with becoming a magistrate at all, by defending the shedding of blood by Christians, for example, than dealing with particular political situations. As he says, his exposition is intended to teach others the necessity of magistrates, not to teach the magistrates themselves. He therefore gives only general guidance. Now let me turn to the 2nd question of the chapter. Quote, what are the laws of a Christian commonwealth? This is the shortest section, but deals with a subject of, quote, vast extent. He limits himself to observations about the laws to be used. He begins with the law of Moses, which he says remains in force for Christians only in its moral precepts, not the judicial and ceremonial. The moral part of the old law can be reduced to the 2 tables of the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments, which together command us to, quote, to worship God with pure faith and piety, and to embrace man with sincere affection. This moral part of the law is that which is given by God and confirmed by our natural knowledge of it left on us by the imprint of his image. The law also has the function of showing the Christian his or her ability to live up to God's holy standard, revealing how radically the sinner is saved by grace, and to push the Christian to freely seek after God in the law without fear of condemnation. It is meant for the benefit of the people and the polity as a lifestyle, not merely simply a code of ethics to keep it together. Calvin juxtaposes these remarks about the moral law given to every conscience with the necessary diversity of modes and punishments in different places. There isn't apparently a particular code of laws to be legislated in every single place uniformly. Now let us turn to the people's duty to obey, which accounts for fully half of the paragraphs in the chapter. He says that the people ought to act towards the ruler according to his office, not just his person. As Calvin has already said, the rulers find their recompense for their misdeeds at the throne of judgment, meaning that they may have the ability to rule in terror and injustice for their entire earthly lives. He says, quote, those who indeed rule for public good are true examples and specimens of God's beneficence. But let us insist at greater length in proving what does not so easily fall with the views of men, that even an individual of the worst character, one most unworthy of all honor, if invested with public authority, receives illustrious divine power which the Lord has by his word devolved on the ministers of his justice and judgment, and that accordingly, insofar as the public obedience is concerned, he is to be held in the same honor and reverence as the best of kings. Doesn't really sound too exciting, does it? Calvin here offers no provision of disobedience when it comes to obeying magistrates, leaving the citizens to suffer in silence at the hands of a corrupt king. Knowing that this is a hard saying, Calvin provides several biblical examples of this being the case to support his point. If you want to, you can see them for yourselves in paragraphs 26 through 29 of chapter 20 in book 4 of his Institutes. The office of a ruler is a holy one, divinely ordained. It is not about the effectiveness of the person in it. It is about the glory of God. He says in 29, quote, "This feeling of reverence and even of piety we owe to the utmost of all rulers, be their characters what they may. The oppressed are not left alone, however. They must wait and trust in the Lord that the judgment will come for these corrupt rulers, if not in this life, then in the next." Calvin encourages those who feel the oppression of unjust kings not to turn to rebellion, but to look into their own lives for wickedness and ponder whether tyrannical rule is judgment for their own crimes. In the face of a high office, the people are first to turn to the things that they can control, their own deeds. If a nation has turned from God, oftentimes he places them under tyrannical rule to remind them of their need of him, like he did with Israel in the time of the judges. God is not the author of evil. He is the perfect judge administering justice upon all people. The natural question to this idea of universal submission to the office of ruler is how the subjects are able to obey him if they are asked to explicitly disobey God. What is to take priority? The obedience to the office of the magistrate or God himself? Calvin finally addresses this in the last 2 paragraphs of the chapter. Quote, "We are subject to the men who rule over us, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against him, let us not pay the least regard to it, nor be moved at all by the dignity which they possess as magistrates, a dignity to which no injury is done when it is subordinated to the special and truly supreme power of God." Once again, the duty of the people is to the office of the magistrate as ordained by God, not the magistrate himself. When he abuses his rule but does not command them to transgress the law of God explicitly, the people are to continue following the office with reverence to the Lord. But when they are called to act against God, the magistrate acts outside of the divine role he has been given, and the subjects are compelled to disobey. Supreme obedience is always to the Lord. Anything else is impiety. God can use the magistrate to exercise his judgment upon the people, but can also use the office to test people's faithfulness on him, as he did to Daniel. Looking back on it as a whole from a rhetorical perspective, Calvin is very purposeful with the outline of this chapter. The natural inclination of humanity is to rebel against those in power over them and will find whatever reason necessary to justify it if they feel slighted. You've probably seen that plenty of times in your own life and even in yourself. Seeing this and the inherent sinfulness of it all, Calvin greatly emphasizes the holiness of the office and God's utilization of it as judgment. He devotes the first 30 sections of the chapter to this and only provides a provision in the last 2 sections. In doing this, he curbs the natural rebellion of humanity to balance obedience to the office of the ruler and to God himself. Well, you may be saying those were a lot of big words, and this seems all well and good, but the question remains, how is a modern Christian to live in a modern, pluralistic society? Let us apply Calvin's thoughts to this by beginning with one of the founding principles of our nation from John Locke. Quote, "The care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate because his power only comes in outward force. But the true and saving religion consists in the inward persuasion of the mind, without which nothing can be acceptable to God." This has been the prevailing reasoning for separating church and state from a religious perspective since the founding of the United States. John Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration can be boiled down to this: forcing religion upon the individual at best breeds a false belief and at worst heresy. The resulting society, then, is necessarily pluralistic. Despite many of these religions having competing exclusive claims to truth, it is still possible to remain civilized with the other. However, problems begin to arise when the state condones and even encourages immoral acts as defined by a religion, pushing the members to resist it. The state cannot show partiality to a religion and stop a certain practice to appease them. And the situation only grows more complicated when there are competing understandings of morality of an action within the church. The question is, though, how a religious person is supposed to follow their own convictions in a pluralistic society when they're at direct conflict with the state. The line between what is and what is not a violation of religious rights has become increasingly blurred. Obviously, compelling someone of a particular religion to do something which they see as a violation of their beliefs encroaches upon religious freedom. But the issue is more complex, seeing that what is condoned by the government can still be seen as immoral without directly applying to the religious person. Extreme immorality condoned by the state must be resisted as all injustice is resisted by Christians, according to Calvin. It says in Isaiah 1:17, "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and please the widow's cause." Clearly, the obligations of a Christian reach far outside the bounds of their own personal area. They are to seek the kingdom of heaven on earth, as Calvin asserted earlier. A counter to this idea can be found in Romans 13:2, quote, "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." This idea is only further driven home by the fact that Emperor Nero was on the throne exacting unjust punishment on thousands of Christians at the time Paul was writing this, putting them on burning stakes to light the road to his palace. Doesn't really sound great to the readers of Paul. Many opponents of religious action posit in light of this passage that Christians are to remain submissive at all times to authority and trust in the Lord instead. The issue with this argument is that the acts and commands of rulers or ruling bodies can be in tension with the law of God, as we have already seen. The Lord does not contradict himself, so the Christian must be obligated to serve the law of God over the law of man in these situations. As Jonathan Mayhew says in his famous sermon on Romans 13, "It would be foolish to cater to the commands of an insane father trying to cut his children's throats." However, the passage still makes a strong case for being incredibly careful when judging whether or not the government has violated God's law. For if it is not broken and the Christian resists, he is resisting God himself. Since liberal society establishes that each religion has equal claims to truth under the law, no religion can be given a preference over another. So, if the state is held captive in this way, according to the principles of such a society, the burden of action falls upon the religious individual. For the Christian, it is not a question of whether or not there should be resistance. That much is clear from Calvin. But rather how they should resist. In the book of Daniel, the Jews are faced with an oppressive regime in a pluralistic society. Daniel and his friends abstain from pagan practices and are rewarded for their faithfulness by God. King Nebuchadnezzar commands them to fall down and worship a golden image of himself, and they refuse. The king then casts them into a furnace where they are saved by God. It seems from this story that civil disobedience is the method by which followers must engage with the state when their beliefs are threatened. But what does civil disobedience look like when government's interaction is not directly forcing the Christian to submit to a certain regulation? As already defined, the permissiveness to sin in society for the Christian is a sin in and of itself, and moreover brings indignation to the hearts of true believers. It would be difficult for a Christian to engage in civil disobedience of the kind Daniel does, because Christians are not the ones being directly affected by the legislation. For a real-world example, the most amount of civil disobedience a Christian can engage in with abortion is by simply not getting one. The problem is, abortion is seen as a societal atrocity by many Christians, so simply not having one is not enough to do justice. The most that could be done is through Christian doctors refusing to perform abortions despite the consequences, but only a small minority of Christians have this option. Civil disobedience as a means of combating sinfulness in society is only effective for Christians when they themselves are facing direct orders that they can act against. So we must look to the other biblical examples to find recourse. In the book of Judges, there's a constant cycle of the Israelites being enslaved for their sin, their eventual repentance, and their liberation by God through a hero. There's plenty of upheaval supported by God in this book and elsewhere in Scripture. Stories like this could lead to some Christians to believe that overthrow of a regime is a legitimate and regular means by which to counteract a sinful society. Something that is being overlooked, however, is the fact that all this upheaval was directly commanded and supplied by God. For every story of righteous rebellion in the Bible, there is more stories of unrighteous rebellion. Absalom's revolution and the split of the United Kingdom and Israel, just to name two. Often in these stories, the people use God as a means to an end that they may delude themselves into thinking that they are righteous in their fight. It is incredibly dangerous to claim the name of God when doing something that may spit in the face of the one he has put in power. This is especially true in a liberal society because it is by nature non-oppressive to the individual. Much like the problem in civil disobedience, legitimate liberal societies do not directly target a religion. The evils in question are not those of direct oppression, but of societal state-sponsored evils. This type of problem can be seldom judged as one requiring extreme force to correct. In one like this, then, violent overthrow is not a legitimate means of correcting evil. So let us turn to yet another case. The book of Esther chronicles the story of a young Jewish girl taken as wife by the king. She uncovers a plot of one of the lead military officials to commit mass genocide of the Jewish people and makes the decision to supplicate the king for mercy. Her petition is heard, the general involved is executed, and the people are given authority to resist the edict, keeping the bloodline of God's chosen people flowing. The principle found in this account has the most relevance to how Christians should address these complex evils. 1 Corinthians 14:33 states, albeit when addressing church order, that, quote, God is not a God of peace, or God is not a God of disorder, but a God of peace. There are certain measures in place that allow for the Christian to act inside of the law to cause change. Liberal society encourages involvement in government and legislation. Supporting legislation that creates a more holy society is a peaceful means for Christians to pursue when attempting to correct evil outside of themselves. Much like Esther working through the framework of her government in order to save the Jewish people, Christians can elect officials who accurately represent their interests. Legislating as a means of change honors the office of the magistrate while supporting holiness in society. Indeed, Calvin himself says concerning popular magistrates that, quote, so far am I from forbidding these officially to check undue license of kings, that if they connive at kings when they tyrannize and insult over the humbler people, I affirm that their dissimulation is by the ordinance of God. It is the duty of those in public office to hold each other in check, especially the ruler, and to challenge him when he's not fulfilling his position in order to protect the weak. This is not the only legitimate means of change, however. In Acts 17:16-34, Paul finds himself in Athens conversing with the people in the town square. He dialogues with members of different philosophies and tells them the story of Christ, converting many. This account of Paul's interaction with members of society shows the final means by which a Christian can support God's law in society. Here, Paul is engaging the people in expressing both care and understanding of their plight. He reasons with them in love, and as a result, many are saved. Christians can change a liberal society to reflect a more holy place in the way that they interact with it. Being holy literally means set apart, and there is no greater way to do this than engaging others in love. In the end, God is the true ruler of all. As Isaiah 33:22 states, quote, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us. He has ordained the powers that be and is in full control of what will happen. Even if the ruler in question is oppressive, violent, or corrupt, the Christian is to trust in God, that he has ordained the individual in office and will bring justice to the world eventually. In the meantime, the Christian is called to obey the law of God, fight for justice, and trust in him. They must live holy lives set apart from the rest, that the rest of society may look upon them and see the face of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason. Now we begin the Q&A. Who would like to go first?
Not all at once.
Let me begin with a question while they're thinking. You also worked on some of the American Puritans as part of your research. How did working on people trying to, in some ways, imitate or put in practice Calvin's teaching help you to reflect upon his teaching? What did you learn about Calvin through thinking about it's being put into practice by certain people?
Well, I think what's really important to remember about the Puritans is they saw themselves in the context of being the last available remnant of the pure church. Their idea was to separate from the Catholic Church, show everybody how great their society was and how well it worked as being a Christian polity under these new Reformed dogmas. And then the rest of the Catholic Church would change. Unfortunately, that didn't work. After a few generations, it was clear that saving belief was not hereditary. So a lot of things that they did was to try to, as Calvin says here, put the moral law into action and have the church help to be with the state as far as like handing down penalties and enforcing things. Where I would say Calvin probably thought that they went wrong is that the church had too much of an executive role. John Winthrop was out there handing down sentences left and right. There wasn't a pure, as pure of a separation as Calvin calls for. So there were definitely some problems in with that. But for the most part, I think their implementation of Calvin's theology, primarily through their strict adherence to the Sabbath laws, for example, and things of that nature. But it was very clear that it was hard to maintain, their take on Calvin's view of polity with the church and the state more connected than Calvin has them. It was hard to maintain that when not everyone was a believer. Rumors of debauchery were flying around, and it was hard to tell what was true and what was not true. And ultimately, their holy mission ended up failing clearly. I would say that they implemented it relatively well, probably the best example that we have outside of Geneva, but still ended up ultimately failing. Ryan?
Yeah, first, thanks for the talk. It's really good. Do it today.
Thank you.
I am wondering about what Calvin would have to say regarding how a Christian would respond in an illiberal society. Like if a government was discriminating against any sort of religion very specifically.
Right.
A very specific designation or target on their heads. How would his theology be adjusted accordingly?
Right. So the question for everyone watching online is that how a Christian is supposed to respond in the face of a society that is discriminatory towards their religion. And I would say that the principles of civil disobedience apply there. We get a lot of examples in the Babylonian exile and in Judges, although they're a little bit more violent probably than what is normally necessary. Specifically with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what they're to do. I mean, Daniel twice in his life disagrees with or performs, civil disobedience against edicts in order to continue serving God. And he's thrown into a furnace and survives, and then he's thrown into a den of lions and survives. Now, as Christians nowadays, we're probably not going to be as lucky as Daniel to be so wondrously delivered. But I would say that the first recourse for the Christian is civil disobedience. To deny, let's say you were in a society that observes Sharia law, and you refuse to worship Allah, and your penalties were being handed down upon you, right? You have to face those with braveness and befitting of a holy person who's following God. And I would just say in general to still observe God's law, even in the face of civil oppression. And Calvin does give in paragraph 11 some recourse for violence if necessary, but that is generally by a Christian sovereign when there are civil rights abuses and spitting in the face of law and God, of the laws and God elsewhere. Luca?
What ought the modern Christian do if the state is persecuting people of a religion that is not Christian? Should they petition the government to stop the oppression of said religious group? And if so, is tolerance a fundamental statute of Christianity?
Yeah. So the question was, once again, that whether or not Christians should respond if there are discriminations towards other religions, and if so, if tolerance is a fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. So clearly Luke has been reading his Locke. So I would say that, the Christian is meant to seek out justice everywhere, right, and correct oppression everywhere. Isaiah is very clear about that. I believe Calvin's very clear about that. So I believe that would involve trying to take preventative measures in the oppression of a certain people. For example, let's say Muslims were being assailed here by some legislation or another. The correct recourse for a Christian would be to love them well and do your best in a grassroots way, personally trying to reach out to people of that faith and love them well, and not by trying to smiling when they're strong-armed into submission concerning a certain religion. I would say, though, I do agree that toleration is important to the Christian faith, but I believe if you're going from Locke's point of view in a letter concerning toleration, that he probably takes it a little too far. For him, tolerance is the fundamental aspect of a Christian, the fundamental thing that makes them Christian. I don't believe Calvin would say the same thing. The point of tolerance is not because, we don't really know who's Orthodox, right? Because everyone's Orthodox unto himself. The point of tolerance is to spread the love of Christ, that they may see, even someone of another religion may see from the Christian someone they viewed as an oppressor, reaching out and loving them well. If that makes sense, that distinction. Good question. Will?
To what extent should Christians participate in civil disobedience on things that don't necessarily directly affect all Christians? So I'm thinking about the civil rights movement.
Like sit-ins and things of that nature?
Right. So it's a question about race, and certainly you have black Christians, but you also have white Christians. To what extent should the Christian body as a whole participate in that specific experience?
Right. Okay. So the question is, once again, so I have to repeat these every time so the camera can pick it up. The question is how a Christian is to respond in issues that affect certain sects of Christianity, but not all of them. That's correct. So in the civil rights movement example that you gave, I would say that it is the duty of Christians to correct injustice everywhere, like Isaiah says. So I think Calvin would be would agree that you're supposed to participate in those activities with him, with the sit-ins and everything. Now it is a little bit more complicated because let's say as a white Christian in that period of time, this is not direct. This legislation is not directly affecting you. So like I was saying earlier, you can fight for certain legislation to be passed, certain corrective legislation, as was done by many Christians in the Senate. Or secondly, to love on the people who are being oppressed. And I think part of loving on the people who are being oppressed means participating in that with them, showing solidarity. Because while every person is subject of a nation, as Calvin makes very clear, they are still subject primarily to God and God alone. So that unity takes place over any sort of political division or any sort of other division. Yeah.
What did Calvin say, if anything, about slavery?
What did Calvin say about slavery? So he doesn't say anything in the politics chapter. I think it's referenced maybe once or twice elsewhere. I know in Geneva, he was not a proponent of slavery. He was very he was way more gracious than people give him account to. A lot of people think about the death of Michael Servetus when thinking about Calvin, and they're like, he's a brutal and harsh man. He wanted this guy to die. I can address that in a minute if you guys want to hear it. But he was really, if you look at his track record, he was clearly very gracious. He urged all Christians, whether in whatever area they may have had dominion over another, to exercise the same grace that he showed and that God has shown us. So I don't believe he would have been necessarily a proponent of slavery by any means. I believe that he would say to any master to exercise grace and love towards their slaves, even to, consider letting them be free. That'd be one of those tricky things, I think, especially in that time period, that would fall under the line between civil and religious ordinance. But he himself, I feel like it's pretty clear from his from the text that he is not for that. He's pretty against suppression by that means.
Okay, getting off the hook for Servetus then.
Okay, so he was so Sabius, for those who don't know, he was a guy who was considered a heretic that was, strolling around denying the Trinity, as well as a few other, he said that infant baptism was demonic, a few other things. So first off, to kind of set the stage, this was a guy that was not really and no one was really in his corner. The Catholic Church didn't like him. The Protestants didn't like him. This was a guy who was universally, we need to get rid of this guy. He was a fugitive. He was on the run. I believe there were orders to seize him and execute him in France and like a few other places. And this guy has the stones to go to Calvin's church and just wandering into Geneva and sitting in his church and listening to a sermon. After that, he's promptly arrested. And Calvin has some pretty harsh writings about execution. So what I think is really important to consider in this is that, Calvin really wanted him to have a more humane execution. He was burned at the stake. Calvin and a few other people really were petitioning hard to have him beheaded instead, as much as of a commutation as that can be. But another thing that's important to remember is that this view that he was having, he was unrepentant. And secondly, his heresy was viewed as treason against God, who in the end is the ultimate high king, right? Treasoners are to be executed among the state laws. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Calvin was 100% justified in what he did, and clearly there is some dissonance between what he says here and in that context. But I think for Calvin, it wasn't about hatred of him. It was way more about wanting to keep the polity pure and address this guy who was going around spouting irresponsible doctrine and was corrupting many Christians. I'm not pro-execution of people who believe differently from me, but I think we probably need to cut Calvin a little bit more slack than often we do concerning that. Dr. Daniels?
So one of the interesting references that you made early on relative to Calvin's view of radical separation of church and state in the sense of they are independent entities, the ecclesiastical authority and the secular authority. You had also alluded, however, to the types of disputes that arise within the ecclesiastical community over theology, not the kind of heresy that Servetius was aligned with, but simply disputes over the proper interpretation of Christian doctrine. Relative to Calvin's view of that kind of separation, which has happened in history, when a church body has disputes that lead them to, say, go their separate ways, to practice their Christianity in their own forms, often requires the use of state power, the use of the magistrate to settle those disputes, to adjudicate them. Do you think that Calvin, and I'm not aware that Calvin spoke of such things, assuming that he didn't think that the church needed to be separated, but applying his thought in the way that you studied it, what would you think would be a proper, if any, role for the state, for the magistrate, to adjudicate property disputes, custodial disputes, things like this that arise more from ecclesiastical reasons than secular ones?
Right, so how a divided Christian body is to be handled by a state which ascribes to a certain orthodoxy under Calvin's idea.
Or even a state, a modern liberal state that attempts to keep a separation. Within the ecclesiastical dispute, is there room for a magistrate to step in and cross that boundary that Calvin would wanted to maintain?
Right. So I think it would be a situational basis. You can claim being a Christian, but if you are, denying the Trinity, having these huge heresies that are clearly unorthodox, despite what Sir John Locke says, that would be something that would be handled much differently than, let's call a secondary issue in the church. Calvin has very harsh words for Anabaptists in this. People who weren't, they really rode the line between disagreeing on primary issues and secondary issues. But he never calls for their head, He yells at them, and he uses harsh language against them, but he never says, we should go off them all, So I don't think that he has this doctrine where he sees the civil government in the kingdom of heaven as being part of two different kingdoms, the kingdom of man and the kingdom of God, right? So the church is the embodiment of the kingdom of God on earth, and the civil government is embodiment of the kingdom of man, both working towards the same end, right? To know God better and to help the citizens know God better. So in a situation like you've described, I believe Calvin would fall on the side of the civil magistrate, working within his duty as the magistrate to allow that separation and to act as a impartial third party in those situations. It's difficult because, as I said in my paper, Calvin does not tell the magistrates what they should or shouldn't do. That's where this work, I think, is very, very distinct from any other political work and all things that we're used to reading. Calvin's not using God as a means to an end. He is using God for God. This is a theological work. He's not concerned about the certain actions that need to be taken. He's only worried about the necessity of the magistrate. So I'm kind of talking in place of Calvin when I'm saying this, but from what I've said, his passion, his balance at the same time for temperance as well as taking action, it would seem to me, and then also if you look at the history of the Presbyterian Church with split after split after split, that Calvin would rather the church be separated and have the civil magistrate deal with that independently than keep the church together, have a ton of conflict within it. Because when the Presbyterian Church was founded, it made itself really prone to splits in order to keep, I think, kind of a corruption of the inside from happening between disagreements with each other. So, if that answers your question, yeah. Will?
So we were talking about heresy and how a Christian magistrate should deal with heresy and disagreement on primary issues versus secondary issues.
Mm-hmm.
How should the Christian magistrate, is it affirming the Nicene Creed? Is it Presbyterians, Reformed Baptists, and some Anglicans in and everybody else out? Where is the line between primary and secondary issues?
Well, let me ask you this. Are you talking about between Orthodox and unorthodox, or are you talking about primary and secondary?
Wherever you and or Calvin would think the line between heresy that should be dealt with and heresy that should be allowed.
Right. So primary and secondary issues is probably where that would fall then. So the difference between primary and secondary issues are considered to be of salvific importance, whether or not somebody is saved. Like if you disagree on a primary issue, you would be believing in a completely different God, not a different interpretation of the same one as described in the biblical text. So those disagreements within the primary issues are where I think heresy would be considered. I don't know if Calvin himself would say this, but not believing in predestination is not necessarily a heresy. Different views on baptism are not necessarily a heresy. These are all secondary issues which cause ecclesiastical division, but not necessarily division as members of the same universal church in Christ. So it is really difficult because in today's modern church, the line between, like I say here, the line between primary issues and secondary issues is starting to blur a lot. We don't really, people say we don't really know where the line is anymore. But for Calvin, he doesn't use the flowery language of Locke saying, every man is orthodox unto himself. We should be careful in these matters. Calvin would be hard-lined. This is a primary issue. This is not. It doesn't matter whether you think this is a primary issue or not. He doesn't really give out a list of those because I think in the time he was writing this, it was kind of assumed what the primary issues were. So dealing with heresy in a Christian polity would be much different for a civil magistrate than dealing with a secondary issue, if that makes sense. Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, so since predestination is brought up now,
The big one.
I think you started off by saying that his political thought is very clearly framed by the 90 pages of theology that come before it in some way. I'm wondering if you could say something about, I can see where there are certain do according to his reading the Bible, and that definitely informs his view of a Christian policy of government. But how do the sort of bigger, what you call more kind of metaphysical or something like that kind of doctrines, like predestination, how do those things affect his view of politics or affect his view of Christian polity? Total depravity, election, predestination, do those things really affect his politics?
I think definitely in the way you can see the way he writes this, he is writing from a total depravity standpoint. Calvin is not the type of guy to say, all right, there's certain elect, and I'm elect, and you guys aren't, and I don't care what you think, ha ha ha. That's not his personality. That's not the way he writes in this. He's very forthright in saying that we can't know anybody else's salvation but our own. We can see certain road marks, if you will, in whether or not somebody seems to be following God, but we can never 100% determine this person is saved, this person isn't, because that would be putting ourselves in the place of God. So in saying that, he doesn't really, even in the consistory, he never says, you are not a Christian, or you do not believe in God. And he doesn't make any laws pertaining to such a thing that only believers can, believers get first access to the bread line. I don't know why I went with that, because he's not Stalin. Or anything like that, And then from a totally depraved standpoint, you can tell he's very clever in the way he forms this chapter. He knows our tendency is to revolt, to find any reason, any inch, any nook, any cranny to push back against the powers that be and establish what we want. Just ask the French. And I think you can see from him making only the last paragraph of a 32 paragraph section being about offering some ability to resist, showing that he knows who he is dealing with. And I mean, if you look at the doctrines of grace that are so fundamental to his theology, he really does, in practice, although once again he doesn't talk about practice specifically in the institutes, but when he's working the consistory, he offers a lot of grace to a lot of people, where other more harsh ecclesiastical bodies would probably hand down a sentence in judgment. So it may not be necessarily very direct in the way he addresses it. He never says, well, since we know that people are totally depraved, blah, 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 blah. He did that the first 990 pages. It's more subtle and more abstract, assuming that you already know what's going on with everything else. Dr. Rothbauer.
I have 3, and I gotta pick one.
Just throw them at me, and I'll answer the easiest one.
Yeah. So is the political stuff that's effectively 1% of the book only there to try and reassure the political powers that his religion is safe? Second question: have you thought about what the book would be like if it were written the opposite way, where the book were truly about politics and then just had religion tacked on at the end? And my third question is, what does a student of politics have to learn from this book?
Okay, I think I can go all 3. So your first question just went out of nowhere. Sorry, can you repeat it?
Is this a postscript?
Right.
Say, hey guys,
Right. And I think, and you can definitely, it's funny because Hobbes does the opposite. I feel like when he's writing in Leviathan, he's like, don't worry, Christianity is really important. And 60 pages in, he's like, there's no God. If you read between the lines. So I don't believe that this is merely something to throw in so that Francis I can be like, oh wow, you know what? Maybe I should adopt this. I think I can say that in good conscience by realizing that he does not give any specific ways in which a ruler should rule, and he gives pretense for disagreement with the powers that be. So this is purely about how the Christian is to be related to government and how the Christian magistrate is to be related to the people. It's not about certain duties. It's more about the relationship between them. So the second one, you're talking about if it was reversed, if this was purely a political work. Well, then I would say that's not Calvin. He's focused purely theologically. I don't think he even says in here that there are different ways that the laws should be tempered according to the type of government and the type of people that you're dealing with. I think it's kind of reminiscent of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws in that way, where he says, like there's not a clear-cut way you should rule based on a certain people. He says, he uses a hypothetical people and says, like, this people may need harsher penalties on adultery because they're, a very lustful people, or these people may need harsher penalties on, establishing property lines. He's intentionally vague in order to give the different types of governments to exercise prudence in what they believe would be the best manner of implementing this to their citizens. So to answer your question, it's kind of a non-answer, but if you were to write this as a purely political work, I don't think he'd have to be writing from a standpoint I think he never wishes to take. I mean, he was a lawyer, but like I said, he doesn't want to be tossed in with having these radical political views and just merely using God as a means to an end. He really wants to emphasize his theological works over this. And then thirdly, for a student in politics, what does this mean? I think it's really important to understand, to read works like this that are theological. If you want more direct stuff, I'd recommend, works by Richard Hooker or St. Augustine if you're looking for brass tacks. This is the way a Christian says that, government should be specifically organized. I think works like this are important because it gives you a glimpse into the mind of someone who views their citizenship as being primarily theological, as being primarily as a citizen of God and not a citizen of, not just a citizen of the state. So I think it's important to read that and get a feel for that because it's very different in that way. And then I think it's important for rulers to read to kind of see the way biblical, like a more biblically based idea about politics that's not as direct, if that makes sense. Sergio?
Does Calvin think that laws can inspire mores, or are the laws just there to penalize people and do a bad thing?
So defining mores in the way that like Montesquieu does it, like in customs, a certain spirit about the people. So I think the difference, but I think Calvin would view a certain spirit as inspiring the laws, if anything else. Once again, like I've said a million times, this is a theological work. He's speaking to Christians. So in your thing about mores, he'd be saying, these mores should exist prior to the laws, and the laws are established in a way for them to properly implement them. So, and then they're also kind of a fail-safe in kind of, like Calvin understands that not everybody in a polity is going to be Christian. The Puritans got that wrong. They thought that they could somehow force it down people's throats and it'll all work out great. So I believe that, the Spirit of God is what inspires the mores, and Calvin would say the same thing. It's not the purpose of the laws. The laws are to establish certain things among men where, we all stumble and fall, right? But to curb licentiousness more than anything else and establish some sort of spirit. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you, Mason. Let's give you a round of applause.
I'll be signing autographs in the back, don't worry.